Greetings, this is Ruby the Nostalgic Catholic with another Isaac Asimov short story. In point of fact, this is the very last one in the whole series of all these different stories, and it's called The Nations in Space. And like the one before it, its initial release and only release is in this collection titled Gold. Isaac Asimov, Gold. The final Gold science fiction collection. So, this one is called The Nations in Space, and it appears on page 101. And so, what's happening here in 101? Yeah, 101 there. Nations in Space. Oh, a modern fable. So, you have these two nations, kind of fictitious. Yeah, they kind of sound to me. I mean, you could probably find lots of combinations of nations, but they kind of come across to me like Iran and Iraq. I mean, it's like, to most of the world, they're like two peas in a pod, but each one just so hates the other. I can remember that, Iran and the U.S. just so absolutely do not get along. But I do remember that during the original Iraqi War in 1991, the Desert Shield going to Desert Storm and all that kind of stuff, Iran actually did us a favor. They allowed us to fly our planes over their country so as to come into Iraq from an unexpected direction. They wouldn't bother to watch as, surely Iran's not going to let any American planes over their country. Well, probably under absolutely no circumstance would they. But so strong was their dislike of the Iraqis, they actually allowed it. So even Iran was part of this, in its own tiny way, a part of this vast international coalition that the elder Bush had put together, to take on Iraq for their invasion of Kuwait. So, I think it only excluded Cuba and Yemen, who simply stayed out neutral. That was all they did. They weren't siding with Saddam Hussein. They just stayed out neutral and sat on the sidelines and said, we're not going to involve ourselves. I think literally every other country on the planet, at least in some way or another, contributed to the war effort. That's almost like a world war, isn't it? Only the whole planet, minus two tiny nations, against one other pretty small nation, too. Anyway, back to the story. It's now the future, and in this future, our electricity comes from huge solar power stations out in orbit around the Earth, and then the power gets beamed to Earth in the form of microwaves. And you have these satellites that maintain these stations. And even though a lot of these things are robot labor, there are still human beings to kind of, do whatever robots and computers can't do. So, turns out you have one of these stations where you have 4 human beings on it. 2 from one of the nations and 2 from the other one. And somebody on one of those people says, I just saw the guy from the other nation made a mistake, and it's probably going to shut the whole thing down. Let's just let it stand and embarrass him. And they kind of think, no, you don't want to do that. Why? Well, this is not terribly interesting, because it could really end up screwing everybody up. Guess what? The more you have international trade and become dependent on that kind of thing and dependent on international cooperation, the more difficult it is to have too big of a war. Now, you can still do it, but I don't know how we're going to do some of this stuff, because it's definitely a problem. And it ends with a nice little moral. I will share the moral. People always love themselves best. Probably more like most, but okay. But in a world so interconnected that harm to one is harm to all, the best way of loving oneself is to love everyone else too. Well, in a way, that's kind of why we have trade, I mean, I've got something you want, you've got something I want, we trade. We're both better off. You know? That's. So trade is, in general, a good thing. I think it can backfire in ways. When jobs go overseas and stuff like that, when there's things that are unequal, but that's a whole different commentary. And that story, again, as I say, it was only published in that collection, which was in turn printed only after he was gone. So it never otherwise saw print, and given that it's a rather small story and not terribly significant, I don't see it getting printed elsewhere unless maybe it's a totally exhaustive, here's all his stories collection kind of a thing. So there it is, and this has been a very fun series to produce. I'm rather surprised to find myself, finally reaching the end of it. I do intend one more installment, kind of conclusion, retrospection, summary of all of this, just as there had also been an introduction. Because although that's a whole lot of stories, some 232 stories in all, or you could say 233 if you wanted, because you have two stories that are really the same one, just one a much earlier, more primitive draft of the other, and then it got lost, and then it got found, and oh look, that's what it is. I combined them, but you could say 233 if you want to count them as two separate stories. That would be, in case you're curious, Big Game and Day of the Hunters. I carry those two together because, as I said, they're the same story. You have the same characters, role, story, denouement, you name it. So, other than that, I've counted that as 232 stories. But obviously, going through the exhaustive list of all the fiction he's written, this leaves an awful lot out, even so. It leaves out whole book fiction that was never, otherwise in magazines. Think of, for example, The End of Eternity, or Prelude to Foundation, and Nemesis, and many of his other classic books. This would also go for some other categories, but I'll talk about all that, kind of have some numbers and stuff in that final wrap-up of the whole conclusion of this whole series. For anybody who's made it through all of these, I don't know. I probably put myself to sleep listening to them. You go to the store. The trick is, look for the story you're interested to hear about. Play the part about that story, and by itself, And if some other story interests you, you can go over to that one. You try to go through all of them, I think. Well, if you have trouble getting to sleep, could be useful for that. Thanks for listening.